Good morning and welcome to the Underbrush, a Liger Studios podcast where we uncover the secrets of marketing. I'm your host, Dakota Ward. I'm so excited to be joined here this morning by President of the White House Historical Association, Stewart McLaurin. Stewart, how are you this morning?
I'm doing really well, Dakota. Great to be with you.
Awesome, man. I had to channel my inner Lewis and Clark this morning because apparently as COVID numbers go down, traffic numbers go right back up. And so I was not blessed with an internal compass, so thank goodness for my phone, even though I do hail from Daniel Boone himself. But enough about my history. Let's talk a little bit about your history and the history of this beautiful, wonderful country that we're so blessed to be a part of. I know you've got a new book that's come out, and we'll hop into that in just a moment. But before we do that, I wanted to give you a chance to first introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, why you do it, and how you got to where you're at today.
Well, thank you, Dakota. It's really wonderful to be with you and your guests and to share a little bit about my role as president of the White House Historical Association. I've just begun my 8th year at this nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was created 60 years ago by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy to support the White House on behalf of the American people. We provide actual funding, non-taxpayer funding every year to maintain the museum standard of the White House. We also have an extraordinary education program to teach and tell the stories of White House history going back to 1792 when George Washington selected that plot of land that the White House is on today. I've been in Washington most of my career. Started early in the right out of school, working in the second term of the Reagan administration, Reagan presidency, and then the Bush 41 presidency. And then the balance of my career has been with nonprofits and higher education. And this role really brings together so many things that I've done in my life. And it's really a labor of love to do this on behalf of the American people.
Sure. And I know that, at least for myself, I really appreciate what you do. And I got to meet you several years ago in my prior role doing cigars for the Liberty Cigar Company. And so you were so gracious to host us up there for a couple of Christmas events. So that was really cool to be a part of. But yeah, so the White House Historical Association, I know what it is, but for the viewers that don't know, that should know, can you give us a little bit of insight into what the association is, what you guys do, and just the role I know Jackie Kennedy had in that?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. When the Kennedys came into the White House in 1961, they found a house largely furnished by New York department store reproduction furniture. Prior to the Kennedys, any new president could come into the White House and get rid of anything they wanted to. So they often sold the old things that we think of as antiques or Americana to buy the newer, more fashionable things.
Sure.
Ms. Kennedy thought the White House should represent the very best of American art and artisans. And to do that, she needed an organization like private museums have, a Friends of. And that's what we became. In our 60 years, we've not accepted taxpayer funding, and we don't use taxpayer funding to provide the things we do for the White House. When you walk in those beautiful state rooms on the White House and the state floor, everything you see, rugs, draperies, furniture, artwork, clocks, we either acquired or we fund to maintain or conserve in some way, reupholster, replace, and we do that with love on behalf of the American people. And we have a great education mission. She started us publishing books with our first guidebook in 1962. And now we publish 4 or 5 books a year, a quarterly magazine, have great teacher institute and education programs, public programs. All of this you can find on our website, whitehousehistory.org.
Yeah, awesome. And so you got there, you said eight years ago?
I'm just starting my 8th year yesterday.
Wow. Well, congratulations. Happy anniversary. How is it that you got there and into that role?
Well, I knew of the White House Historical Association for many years. Most people know it through the annual White House Christmas ornament, which is a small teaching tool. It's an American-made ornament that we produce every year and have since Mrs. Reagan launched that in 1981. But not everyone knew what the full part of our mission, and it's really rich and wonderful. But I knew of that through the years. My predecessor was a great man, but he was there for 22 years. So it wasn't like a job that came open very often. And
Right.
when it did, I was approached about my interest in the role and had the privilege of interviewing with a terrific board, and it led to my selection. And it's just been a great adventure. I love to say that I could work there the rest of my life and not know all there is to know about White House history. So every day is an adventure in not only teaching, but also in learning.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say that that's pretty consistent as far as really any history is. You can never know it all, right? And that's part of the beauty of the journey of it, is just getting to walk along the same lines as the men and women before you, and kind of put yourself into that same context. Because I think that's a very important thing to think about when you're reading history, is to try and just engross yourself in that context, right? And so it's so easy today to judge past actions on present day circumstances. And so anytime I read history, and the more you read history, the easier it is to do, but put yourself in the context of their shoes. What was it like? What was it like to design and build the White House, which has become an icon for the entire world, right? And so I know that that's part of what your book is about. And I've actually got a copy here that you were so kind to send this to me.
Good for you.
This is a beautiful book. So I know this is out, ready, available for purchase. But it's James Hoban, Designer and Builder of the White House, by Stewart D. McLaurin. So Stewart, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about the book. What was the inspiration behind that? I know the association has a publishing side to it. And so is this through the publishing of the White House Historical Association?
That's right. We publish this book. We're like a university press where we publish our own books from time to time. We will publish a book for another history-related entity connected in some way to the White House, such as Blair House. We published a wonderful book about Blair House, the president's guest house. But this book goes directly to the core, to the very beginnings of White House history. George Washington met James Hoban in Charleston during Washington's Southern tour in 1791. A year later, he selected Hoban to be the architect of the White House. Hoban had come from Ireland in his mid-30s. He was Roman Catholic, and so the penal laws in Ireland really prevented him from advancing to the heights of his career. So I like to think he was an early pursuer of the American dream, coming to this country where he knew he could advance his interests beyond what he would have done in his home country. He was well trained by Thomas Ivory, a famous Irish architect. He had school training. He was exposed to some extraordinary buildings in Ireland, which I've had the privilege to see. And as you look at those buildings, the Leinster House, where the Irish Parliament meets, the old Newcomen Bank, which is now a government building, and you see these buildings, you can clearly see how they inspired Hoban's design for the White House.
Sure.
So Washington met him in Charleston on the Southern tour, brought him to the then federal city we call Washington, D.C. today, and set about building the White House. And Hoban collected an array of workers to build the White House, and pretty much completed enough for John Adams to move in 1800. It really wasn't completed until about 30 years later in full.
Wow. Yeah. One thing that stuck out to me in reading this book was, and maybe it's just because I can also relate, is, when Washington was in Charleston and he met Hoban down there, he remembered the event, but he could not remember his name.
That's right.
I find that to be hilarious because I myself, I could tell you what he was wearing. I could tell you what we were eating. I remember the conversation, but for whatever reason, the names sometimes will go in one ear and right out the other.
Well, I think he also remembered Hoban because he knew he was Irish, and he had seen the county courthouse there he had built and some other buildings. And Washington wanted to build it in stone. And he knew that Irish architects or builders were accustomed to that from Ireland, not common here in our country. But Washington thought a stone house for the president's house would be respected by the capitals of Europe and by Americans as well, because it represented strength and it was different than the normal home in the United States.
Sure. And is there any part of longevity that comes with stone? Because you can build a house out of wood and it's going to fall a lot faster than a house out of stone.
Well, there was longevity with this from 1800 to about 1814 when the British advanced with their torches and set fire to it. The wall on three sides did tumble, But President Madison brought in Hoban again, and it was important to Madison to rebuild the White House. There was a push to move it as far west as Cincinnati, where our country extended at the time, or move it to higher ground or more secluded place in the federal city. But Madison said, no, it will be here and it will be rebuilt. So Hoban came back in with others, rebuilt the White House as in those same size, same proportion, and it has stood as it was rebuilt ever since that time. Truman undertook a major interior renovation that totally gutted and went down to the sub-basement ground. But those walls have always stood since they were rebuilt in 1814 as a symbol of American freedom and democracy to the world.
Sure, that's so fascinating, and I know you know my parents well. They're both architects, and so I guess inherently I geek out a little bit about this because just the creativity. You know, you think about how he was able to be inspired by different kinds of styles and different buildings from his homeland and from others abroad of designing this. And so can you speak a little bit to the design aspect of the White House?
Well, I think Washington had in his mind's eye what he wanted, and I think that was the stone house feel of that. I think he and Hoban communicated well. They were both Masons, Freemasons, and Hoban was able to speak freely with Washington. Now, between Washington and Hoban, there was a group of commissioners that had been appointed in Washington, which adds a little bit of bureaucracy to the mix. But I think Hoban and Washington were pretty strong-headed, and they pushed forward the design that they wanted. And when you walk into the blue room, the Oval Room on the State Floor today, it is perfectly reminiscent of the Oval Rooms in the Newcomb Bank in Dublin. When you walk up under the north facade of the White House and you see the windows and the way that is structured, it is perfectly reminiscent of Leinster House in Dublin, where the Irish Parliament meets. So I think they knew what they wanted. They communicated well. Interestingly, we have no record that George Washington himself actually visited or went into the White House during the time it was built or after it was built. We believe he stopped by on his way back to Mount Vernon after he left Philadelphia as president. Hoban fancied himself somewhat as a militia leader, so he summoned all of his workers, his carpenters and builders and stonecutters, marched in front of General Washington, President Washington, as if they were militia. But the story is that he continued on to Mount Vernon and did not go into the house, which is puzzling to me. But you know, it's just a strange fact of the White House story.
Very interesting. Yeah, the fact that, all right, go build it. I hope you can do it well, and I'm not going to be there to oversee it.
It's a sign of a good leader too. You know, hire good people, put them in place to do their jobs, and then let them do their job.
Right. And I think that is so true of any kind of leader, is to not micromanage, right? We do our best work when we don't feel the pressure or the eyes of our boss in the back of our head.
And the irony is, you know, George Washington, a name that is known the world over, but few people know the name James Hoban. But what's extraordinary about Hoban is his life's legacy is known by 3 words: the White House. And that's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible even. And I think part of the story that's interesting is just the way that the two of them were able to communicate back and forth, and just the congruity that they had. Because I know oftentimes an architect and then the homeowner or the builder will have a lot of quarrel back and forth. And I think that their relationship between the two of them was something to be just fascinating to me.
Well, there was quite a bit of discussion about what the size of this house should be. Jefferson had submitted a proposal anonymously, another name to be the architect. Of course, it was fairly well known that it was Jefferson, and he was not selected. He had a concern that the White House not be too grand, too European. So there were many opinions that were engaged in this. But of course, Hoban stuck to the task of actually building the house and put together the right team of workers. It was built by stone, by American stone from the Aquia Quarry about 30 miles south of Washington down the Potomac River. That had to be brought up river. Somebody had to carve this stone. Those skills were not known widely our country. So 7 Scottish stonemasons were brought over to carve the stone. There were enslaved laborers that worked on the White House that were hired from slave owners.
Mhm.
And we have done a tremendous amount of research, a little bit for this book, but our website is a treasure trove of research on the 300 or so people we have identified as enslaved people who worked to build the White House or worked for our early presidents in the White House. Of course, there were free workers, carpenters, and others, and they worked in this community, what we now know is Lafayette Park, just north of the White House.
Mhm.
That's where the carpenter shed was. That's where they all worked, and they lived around that area. They ate around that area, and then they wanted to worship around that area. So Hoban was Roman Catholic. He actually built the first church of any kind in the federal city. There was a Catholic church in Georgetown, Holy Trinity, but that was thought to be a little far away. So he built St. Patrick's, and the successor to the church he built is still there today as St. Patrick's. The stonemasons were Presbyterian from Scotland, so they worshipped in the carpenter shed, and the National Presbyterian Church in Washington traces its roots back to those Presbyterian worshipers in the carpenter shed at Lafayette Park. So a tremendous amount of city history and cultural history that emanated from that building project.
Sure. And you talk about the stone and just the relevance and the importance of that. I know that you might have a piece of stone that is significant. Do you have that with you this morning?
I do. This is a sample of the stone from Aquia. So you can see it is a sandstone, a look and feel. This would have been very similar to what the Scots would have had in Edinburgh. In fact, if you go to Edinburgh in the Newtown area, that's where they would have been working before they came here. I recently had the privilege of going back over and putting a plaque on 2 homes on Queen Street that our Scottish stonemasons went back and built after they finished the White House project. But this is a very porous sandstone. It became called or described as the White House because once it was built, it had to be whitewashed to prevent water seepage into the cracks and expanding and splitting the stone. And then after the War of 1812, when it was rebuilt, it started being painted white. And so, but it wasn't until the Teddy Roosevelt administration or presidency at the turn of the 20th century that it was formally officially called the White House. That's when Roosevelt put it on the letterhead, the White House. Those letters, those words we're very familiar with on letterhead today.
Wow. And you may have mentioned this, you may have not. Where does this stone come from, and how did we get it here?
Well, it was fascinating. 30 miles down the Potomac River is a little place called Aquia, Virginia in Stafford County. If you're going up and down I-95 between Richmond and Washington, you'll see an exit, and you could still go there. It's a county park today. It's an incredible visit. In the book, there's a picture of me there, and you can still see the markings of the men who drove the rods down between the rock, split it apart, pieces of this rock that was then, they would drag it down to the Potomac River, put it on rafts, and then they had to pull it upriver 30 miles.
Wow.
The Potomac is deep, so they had to stay close to the edge, and they would offload it there, and then they would drag it over to what is now Lafayette Park for the stonemasons to cut it. And it was fascinating that the labor that went into that to provide enough stone to build the White House from that one little quarry.
Yeah. What's so cool, so fascinating about the men and women of this time was their ingenuity. And so, and in my brief bout of pretending to be a historian myself, I've done a little bit of American history research, and part of it was you're familiar with Henry Knox.
Yeah, sure.
And so he was a bookseller, and so he was tasked by Washington with moving a lot of this artillery during the Rev War. And so they come across a river, and the river's name escapes me, but they have this heavy artillery, and it's the middle of winter, and so the river is frozen over, but it's not enough to where they feel comfortable to be able to cross with all this heavy artillery because they don't want to lose it. So what does he do? He takes a screw and he bores some holes in it. And so what that does is that allows the river to flow, and it comes up through those holes, and then it would refreeze. And so they kept doing that until it was thick enough to where they felt comfortable to come across. And so just the ingenuity of these guys and girls back then was just, I mean, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, I think we had a lot of MacGyver characteristics in those early.
Yeah, absolutely, no doubt.
You mentioned love of history and being a historian, and this is, I think, so important. You know, not everyone is called to be a deep, um, to know a lot about American history. We study it in school. We study it less in school today, which is so important for organizations like ours to step up and help fill that gap. But history is a broad topic, and I think it's really important no matter what field someone may be in. If you're not intent on focusing on the full story of American history, learn the history of your vocation and your field, your career. For this, for example, this is a wonderful book for architects to learn a little bit of American history through the field of architecture. And I think that there's so many ways that we can learn about our past to better our future. We tend to think that history begins with us and our generation in so many ways. And when we watch the news, it's only about the now without the context that you mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And without the context, we're just either doomed to fail again or not to have properly learned the lessons of the past to build toward the future. So history is critically important for our government leaders, for our president, for our members of Congress to know, respect, and understand, but for every American in their own situation, and to teach their children, to make sure their children have an exposure to history education as well.
Sure. And there's a stigma behind history repeats itself. And I think that's only because we don't know our history, right? And so, we continue to do the things that we've done before because we decide for whatever reason not to learn from the mistakes or the successes that we've done before.
That's right. Well, we careen through life in absolute confidence of the knowledge that we have in our own heads,
Mhm.
aware of all the other knowledge that there is out there. And we feel we're a little foolish. We are foolish in that regard. If we don't benefit our own work, our own lives, with the historical context of those who have gone before us in our country and in our work fields. It was everyone who's preceded us. My predecessor was there for 22 years. I learned from things that he tried and didn't do and didn't succeed with. I learned from things that he did succeed with. But on a bigger note, for our country, I truly believe it is so important for our presidents, our members of Congress, our governors, to really look at everything through the prism of history. They are just the next one in the continuum of
Sure.
those leaders. And to understand the full of it is important, not just the now of it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to put into context and perspective of, really how young we are as a country. I mean, this is year 245 of this, beautiful experiment we're a part of. And so when you think about, Rome and the history of Rome and the dynasties of China, I mean, those are thousands of years old. And so we're really in our infancy. But I think that explains a little bit about, where we are today, but remembering, where we come from. And I think that was so important to the founders to know that history, to be broad in their knowledge of knowing, what worked in Rome and what didn't, what worked in Greece and what worked in Spain and what worked in England and what didn't work in England. And so we got away from that. And for whatever reason, it feels like we're starting to repeat things here and there. And I think it's so important for, people like myself, of my age, to follow in the footsteps of what you guys are doing over there at the association.
And Dakota, it's even scarier than that. We forget what has happened even in the short history of our own country. World War II, the Great Depression, World War I, the Civil War, and the issues that predicated those significant events, and our engagement or non-engagement, or things we did or did not do. It's so important not to be naive about our own American history. The world history that you mentioned is extraordinary and significant and important, but we need to think about our own recent history. All of these guys that have been president of the United States prior to now, each had a story, each had successes, each had failures, each encountered things with our country that may repeat itself in terms of international issues or economic issues. It's so important to be aware of those things and learn from them. Some of our presidents have been prolific readers of biographies. George W. Bush read, I understand, historic biographies quite a bit and learned from those. Others, not so much. They may listen to others who tell them the history, but by whatever means they receive it, I think it's important that they staff themselves and give them the opportunity to benefit from that important knowledge.
Sure. Yeah, and there's a historian by the name of David McCullough. If you're familiar with him, he said, I think this is in a speech to a college. He used to do that a lot and give the final speech at the end of the graduation. And he said, read history. By all means, read history. And I think that's so important to read history and not to watch history, because, and not to say watching history is bad, whether it's a documentary or other. But when you read, you allow your own interpretation to happen, and rather than taking the interpretation of someone else who read it and puts their spin on it. And so being able to do your own research, I think is so important to do it on your own.
And even McCullough's works have in some measure been turned into viewable product. And I think that whether you listen to podcasts, whether you read books, whether you watch a cable series on John Adams, I love the idea of reading. I think that is primary and important, but you can consume information, driving to and from work, listen to historic podcasts that way, or while you're running through earbuds, or while you're on a flight. There's so many ways to budget education and learning about history into your daily life.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go back to school and get a master's degree, or you can take doses into your daily life. And yesterday I read a fascinating article about a topic that I thought I knew something about. And when I read this article, I thought, wow, it just made me hungry for more, because I did not know that other side of the equation, that particular story. And, it's a fascinating field, and it's so important to us. We just tend to feed off of the breaking news and what's going on now. But the really interesting and exciting and compelling things are the stories that got America to where we are today.
Right. Yeah. And you talk about just learning the other side of the story. And I heard it, I think this is a lawyer saying, but there's 3 parts to any story. There's side 1, side 2, and then there's the truth.
And it's what the lawyer tells you it is. That's
right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, I did want to ask you a little bit about, because I know you got this book. I know that you guys are so heavily involved in the ornaments, which I know my mom is a huge fan of. I think she has every single one. Going back to when they first started, she's been able to get those.
Great.
But because this is a marketing podcast, I did want to ask you, how are you using marketing today to further the story of what you guys are doing over there, and further the knowledge and the education that needs to be known about the White House and the White House Historical Association?
It's an excellent question, and it's certainly a big focus of my concern and worry on a day-to-day basis. We're a 60-year-old organization. We have a fantastic public-private partnership story to tell. The products that we sell support our work, like our ornament and their educational tools. We don't do T-shirts or souvenir-y things. We do things and products that really help advance the story of the White House and its history. But how do you share that with an American populace, a demographic of our customer, if you will, has traditionally been older, has traditionally been female, and yet this is a wide, big country out there. And how do we expose who we are and what we do, not only the offerings of our books and our ornaments and our other gift items, but how do we share this great, rich, wonderful history of the White House with a broader mix? So one of the first things we did, and it worked very, very well for us, is to build partnerships that have tentacles and reach beyond where we do. For example, a wonderful Atlanta-based organization called the Boys and Girls Clubs of America. And early on, we developed a curriculum of American history based on White House history. And we deployed that through a partnership with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America that went to communities all over our country, places we could not reach. Even in our hometown of Washington, D.C., we had a partnership with the Washington Nationals baseball team for 81 home games over 3 seasons. We had an interactive White House quiz on the screen. And so the announcer would be, I'm with Sally in section 27, and she's going to take the White House History Challenge. And if Sally got the answer right, she got the White House Christmas ornament. And it was a way not just to promote our ornaments, but to promote our education mission. So partnerships have been very important and key. Taking advantage of social media. We have so much content that is so rich and vital and valuable, and finding new ways through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter to deploy that. And we have our growth in Facebook followers has been hockey stick because of we've really stayed true to historic content on our Facebook channel, and that has been a really terrific. Now what we're doing is we're taking what has traditionally been in-person programming for us and converting that to digital offerings, and that has been, through COVID, off the charts. People have been interested and hungry for that. And anyone who's interested in following us on social media, I'd love for you to. I'd love, Dakota and your colleagues to give us feedback. We also always want to learn and do better, and share this information with your friends. I won't be shy. I'll promote my own podcast, the 1600 Sessions. And right now I put out a monthly episode of those, and each one unpacks a different story of White House history with someone who either worked in the White House or had a unique role there or had some perspective on history. And like you do with these podcasts, it's so wonderful to learn. I love doing them because I learn, but you get to share these stories through the podcast platform. So we're always exploring new things and new ways of doing, but those are three examples of how we've done and we've reached some success.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to remember, as teachers like yourself, and I used to want to be a teacher. I started school going into secondary ed until I realized I don't like kids that much, so so I backed out of that. But I think it's important, as teachers, to be able to teach in a myriad of ways, right? Whether it's, hands-on or it's through digital or whatever it is, because everybody learns in their own way. And so while I myself promote reading simply because my dad said if God didn't want us to read, he wouldn't have made the Bible a book. There are so many other ways, and because technology advances how we learn, to be able to push it out through a podcast or to push it out through an ebook or a physical book, just being able to continue to push, every kind of student. We're all students and how to learn.
We have a wonderful partnership with Amazon Web Services that has created many new tools for us. One is a new tour app of the White House. So whether you're in Washington, D.C., going through the White House as a visitor, whether you're in St. Louis or whether you're in London, you can experience the rooms of the White House. And we change it seasonally, and we change it when there are new items added to the White House collection. And we may have some exciting new elements of that we'll be adding over the coming year. There's some gamification elements in there where you can take a selfie and it analyzes your facial structure against the presidential and first lady portraits and tells you which one you most like. So anything we can do like that engages interest. And I feel like once we hook people, they feel like history is dusty and uninteresting. Once they realize that it's not, then we hook them into that, and then they explore learning through all of our other assets and resources.
Yeah, and I think it was Winston Churchill, don't fact check me on this, but I believe he said, the farther back I look, the farther forward I can see. And so that's so pertinent to what you do. But Stewart, we're getting a little pressed for time here. So it was such an honor, such a pleasure to have you on the show. I wanted to give you a chance to let the viewers know, what's the best way to get in contact with you? How do they support the association and everything that they're doing? And where can they go and get this wonderful book and learn a little bit more about the White House?
Well, everything you would want to know and need about the White House Historical Association, you can find on our website, whitehousehistory.org. You can contribute to support our nonprofit mission. We have wonderful giving groups with various different benefits to those. We have extraordinary public programming every week that you can take advantage of. Our social media is wonderful. We have in-depth articles published on our website. We have the research that I mentioned on the enslaved persons, which is really, right at this point, a 5-year research project that you can see the results of. So our website is a treasure trove. We also offer an aggregated page on our website where we can be one-stop shopping for all presidential history. You can look on this page for the teaching assets at any presidential site across the country for any president and redirect to their tools and resources also. So for educators, for parents, for students, for journalists, for authors, for podcast leaders, anybody, we are a real asset. And I really encourage you to explore our website. I'd love for you to buy the book. I'm very proud of this. It is really fundamental to White House history. And then we talked about the stonemasons. We have another book, White House of Stone, that's the partner book to this one that tells that story as well.
Fascinating. Well, again, Stewart, thanks so much for joining me this morning. I know you are such a busy man. You got a lot going on. And so it's been such an honor to have you on the show this morning. But for the viewers, thank you guys for waking up early and checking this out and joining me and Stewart here. You've been watching The Underbrush. I'm your host, Dakota Ward, was joined here this morning by President of the White House Historical Association, Stewart McLaurin.
Thank you, Dakota, very much. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely.